Elijah West knew something was wrong the moment Dusty refused to meet his eyes. The morning sun had barely cracked through the gray Colorado sky, casting pale gold across the frost-laced eaves of the stable roof. A wind rolled down from the timberline range, brittle and dry, rattling loose cedar shingles as if the land itself were shivering. Elijah stood at the open gate of his paddock, gloved hands gripping the reins as Dusty stepped out of the horse trailer like he'd aged 5 years in just 3 days. The mustang's stride was uneven. Not lame, not quite limping, just measured, wary. Elijah had raised Dusty from a feral, dust-coated yearling into the proud animal now known across Granite Hollow as the stallion that didn't spook. Dusty had seen wildfires and wolf packs, crossed frozen creeks at midnight, carried Elijah down shale hills in silence. That horse wasn't afraid of anything. Until now. He didn't nicker in greeting, didn't nudge Elijah's chest like usual. Just stood there with his head slightly lowered, flanks tight, eyes distant as if searching for something that had once been safe. The Golden Spur had promised heated stalls, plenty of feed, soft bedding. It was the only licensed stable operating through the Winter Holler Festival, and with half the ranch roads iced over, Elijah had reluctantly left Dusty there for 3 nights. Now he was regretting it with every second. Elijah removed the lead rope and let Dusty walk the short length to the barn. Halfway there, Dusty hesitated, then turned sharply, almost as if something invisible had struck him. Elijah narrowed his eyes. Back inside the barn, he unbuckled the winter blanket and froze. Just behind Dusty's right foreleg, a bruise the size of a skillet spread down the ribcage deep purple, swollen, edges jagged like someone had lashed him with a blunt object. A matching mark darkened his hind flank. Elijah reached forward, fingers tentative. Dusty flinched. "No way you got that rolling in straw," he muttered, voice low as gravel. "Not a chance." The injuries were too specific, too intentional. Elijah scanned the stall, inspecting the bedding, walls, posts. Nothing broken. No blood. No reason Dusty should look like he'd fought a freight train. He moved to the feed room and pulled out his old first aid crate. Kneeling beside Dusty, he cleaned the bruises with iodine, the smell rising like bitter memory. Dusty didn't make a sound, but his body trembled, just once. That shook Elijah more than a scream would have. 7 years, 7 winters. This horse had stood next to him while he buried his only daughter, had waited outside VA clinics, slept beside him during those nights when sleep was a war of its own. And now somebody had laid hands on him. Somebody had thought they could break a mustang like Dusty and get away with it. The bastard didn't know what they'd just started. Elijah poured warm water into the feed trough, dropped extra alfalfa, then paused. Something small caught his eye beneath the fresh straw. Wedged into the edge of Dusty's mane was a narrow strip of leather, a braid, maybe 2 inches long, with a tarnished brass claw hook hanging from it. It didn't belong there. He pulled it free. The metal was old but sturdy. Letters were carved faintly along the underside. Baylock Ranch. Elijah's breath caught. Baylock had been shut down 3 years earlier. Animal rights activists had exposed them for injecting sedatives into wild mustangs to break them faster for high-dollar buyers. The state vet had pulled their license after photos leaked colts tied to posts, raw with whip marks, eyes swollen shut. He'd seen those pictures once. He'd never looked again. How had a tag from Baylock ended up buried in his horse's mane? Dusty turned his head slightly, meeting Elijah's stare for the first time. And in that stare, half-haunted, half-defiant Elijah saw the storm rising beneath the bruises. Not just pain, but a memory, a warning. Someone had tried to break Dusty, and Dusty had remembered who he belonged to. Elijah slid the barn door shut behind him. He didn't light the porch lantern, just stood there in the cold, holding that brass hook in his palm like it was a loaded weapon. Granite Hollow was a quiet town. Too quiet, if you asked him. Men with land kept to themselves. Secrets froze deeper in the soil than snow ever could. And whatever Dusty had endured, it hadn't happened by accident. Tomorrow, he'd go back to the Golden Spur and ask questions. Not just to Pete, the stable owner, but to the investors who'd bought the property last spring. Word was, someone new had moved in. Someone with big plans and a bigger wallet. The kind of man who didn't care what bled under his boots. Elijah's hands curled tight. He wasn't a soldier anymore, not on paper, but some instincts don't forget the uniform. And Dusty was no ordinary horse. Whatever had started that weekend hadn't ended yet, and as the wind swept ice through the hollow and the bruises beneath the frost began to ache, Elijah West made a silent vow. Whoever touched his Mustang would learn exactly what it meant to provoke a ghost. The frost hadn't melted when Elijah returned to the Golden Spur. Snow crackled beneath his boots as he crossed the long dirt lot toward the main barn, the air dry and too still for comfort. From a distance, the stable looked unchanged. Same red cedar siding, same crooked flag above the tack shed, same faded mural of a bronco on the south wall. But something in the silence had shifted. It felt less like a ranch and more like a stage where someone had forgotten to lower the curtain. Inside, the faint smell of ammonia clung to the air, laced with a chemical tang Elijah didn't recognize. Stalls were cleaner than they should have been for early morning. Too clean. It was as if someone had scrubbed the place raw in a hurry. Sawdust fresh enough to still clump underfoot. Pete Hargrove wasn't behind the front desk like usual. Instead, Elijah found him down by the western stall row, hunched over a feed chart, pencil tapping nervously against the page. His eyes darted up when he saw Elijah. "You're back early," Pete said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought Dusty'd be settled in by now." "He would be," Elijah said evenly, "if he hadn't come home covered in bruises." Pete flinched, just slightly, but it was enough. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "He looked fine when we loaded him. Maybe he scraped himself back at your place." "I didn't come for excuses, Pete," Elijah cut in, voice low. "I came for the truth." Before Pete could answer, the sound of polished boots echoed against the plank floor. A man stepped into view from the opposite stall, wearing a charcoal wool coat and a scarf the color of bone. His hair was slicked back, boots dustless despite the muddy path outside. His presence didn't match the stable. He was too composed, too polished, the kind of man who bought horses for sport, not love. "You must be Mr. West," he said, offering a hand Elijah didn't take. "Victor Kincaid, new co-owner of this fine establishment." Elijah stared. Victor's smile didn't waver. "I heard you're the one with that Mustang Dusty, right? Impressive animal. Must be hard keeping a creature like that in check." "He doesn't need checking," Elijah said. Victor's eyes twitched. "Oh, I imagine you'd say that. But wild stock needs discipline. A stallion only behaves if he remembers who's boss." That word remembers stuck in Elijah's mind like barbed wire. Victor turned to Pete. "Give us a minute, would you?" Pete hesitated, but after one glance from Kincaid, he nodded and disappeared toward the back tack room, shoulders hunched like a man carrying debts on his spine. Left alone, Victor strolled slowly past the stalls, fingertips grazing the polished wood. "You know," he said, "horses are assets. Some people forget that. Let emotions get in the way." Elijah didn't speak. He was watching Dusty's stall, the one the Mustang had stayed in while here. One plank, near the back, was slightly darker than the rest, sanded smooth recently, erased. Victor stopped, turned. That horse of yours, he's got fire. But fire burns things. You ever think maybe someone did you a favor, taking the edge off? Did you do me that favor? Victor's smile slipped for the first time. Just saying there are ways to make a horse more manageable, for the right buyer. I'm not selling. No, Victor said, brushing his coat sleeve. But everything's for sale eventually. Elijah didn't answer. He just walked to Dusty's stall, opened the gate, and looked down. There, half buried beneath new bedding, was a length of rope frayed at one end, the fibers stiff. And in the sawdust near the edge, a faint streak of dark brown. Too red for manure. Too old for paint. Blood. Victor followed his gaze. Accidents happen. Elijah didn't look up. He reached down and picked up something else pressed into the dirt where Dusty's hooves would have stood. It was a brass badge, round, faintly tarnished, and unmistakably military. He turned it in his hand. 2nd Cavalry Division, Equine Unit. It had been decades, but Elijah would never forget that insignia. Victor's voice was suddenly closer, clipped now. I'd be careful digging up old ghosts, West. Not everything buried wants to be found. Elijah pocketed the badge. I've known ghosts that scream louder than the living, he muttered. He left the stable without another word. But that afternoon, while brushing Dusty in the fading winter sun, he noticed something odd. The mustang kept pacing to the edge of the stall, tapping his hoof near the wall, then looking back at Elijah. Tap. Pause. Turn. Tap again. It wasn't random. Elijah crouched, ran his fingers along the edge of the wooden floorboard where Dusty had been tapping. Nothing at first. Then just beneath the corner, tucked behind the hay bin, something folded. He slid it out, a piece of lined paper. Torn. Faint ink bleeding through the wrinkles. A kid's handwriting. They did worse to the wild ones. Dusty wasn't the first. L. He stared at the note, the ink shaking slightly in the cold air. The paper smelled faintly of sweet feed and fear. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat in the darkened barn, Dusty beside him, staring at the old badge in his hand, the blood-marked rope on the table, and the slip of paper on his knee. He thought of the word Victor used, manageable. He thought of the name on the braid in Dusty's Main Baylock ranch. And he remembered what it felt like to ride patrols where men whispered rumors about ghost stables and military units that trained animals to forget pain until they forgot themselves. But Dusty hadn't forgotten, and neither would he. The storm had passed, but the tension hadn't. In the silence of the early afternoon, Elijah guided Dusty down the narrow service road behind the Granite Hollow Town archives, wheels crunching over half-frozen gravel. Clara sat beside him in the passenger seat, arms crossed tightly over her coat, her face unreadable behind the scarf she refused to pull down. They hadn't spoken much since the discovery of the old spur in Dusty's mane, but something about the metallic weight of it, etched with Baylock Ranch, had stirred a bitter familiarity in Elijah's gut. He knew the name. Everyone in Granite Hollow did, or at least the version of it people were allowed to remember. But Clara knew the version they weren't. The archive building sat squat and sagging behind the town council offices, mostly ignored except by retired history buffs and the odd clerk on filing duty. Elijah had a different reason to be there. Luca's note scrawled in pencil on the back of a feed receipt kept flashing in his mind like a flare gun in the dark. They did worse to the wild ones. Dusty wasn't the first. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed as they flickered overhead. The air smelled of old paper, dried glue, and dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. Clara pulled on latex gloves from her satchel habit from her clinic and began thumbing through the file cabinets while Elijah searched the property records drawer. The chill of the room seeped into his bones, but not even that dulled the fire tightening in his chest. It didn't take long to find what they came for. Hidden between zoning maps and livestock transfer logs was a yellowed manila folder stamped with Baylock Property Seizure 2009. The last year the ranch had legally existed. Elijah flipped it open. There were invoices, vet reports, a letter from the Department of Agricultural Welfare, 4 incidents marked with red tabs, 4 horses, each labeled as aggressive or non-compliant, each euthanized due to unsuitable temperament, all before the age of 6. But then came something unexpected. A transfer deed Baylock sold, absorbed into a shell company named Silver Track Holdings, LLC. Below that, a signature, Victor Kincaid. Elijah's jaw tightened. So it hadn't just been an investment, it was resurrection under a different name. He passed the file to Clara, who scanned the documents quickly, then paused. "This logo," she murmured, tapping her gloved finger on the corner of a supply invoice. "Military issue. This type of neuroblocker. It's only used by veterinary units who deal with high-risk combat animals." Elijah stared at the label, Dex 314, Cognitive Response Suppressant. It chilled him. This wasn't about taming mustangs, it was about breaking memory. The implications settled in like fog. Clara gently set the folder aside and opened her phone, scrolling through encrypted files. "Last week, I ran tests on Dusty's fur samples," she said. "There's a trace of the same compound. Weak now, but still detectable." He swallowed hard, vision narrowing. Someone had used combat-grade neurochemicals on a domestic horse, and not just any horse, but his. Dusty had been a free-roaming Mustang for most of his life, and he'd earned every scar on his legs honestly, outrunning storms and wolves in equal measure. But what Dusty had been subjected to wasn't nature. It was intent. They left the archives with more than files. They left with motive. That night, back at the ranch, Elijah couldn't sleep. The wind beat against the boards of the barn like fists. He lit a lantern and walked to Dusty's stall. The Mustang lifted his head slowly, nostrils flaring. He wasn't twitchy anymore, he was just tired. Elijah leaned over the rail and whispered, "You remember more than they wanted, don't you?" Dusty stepped forward and nudged his palm. It was a gentle push, almost apologetic. Elijah blinked. It felt familiar, like the kind of gesture a soldier gives to another after surviving the same battlefield. The floor creaked beneath Dusty's weight. He tapped the ground with his front hoof once, twice, then backed up toward the far wall of the barn. Elijah followed cautiously. The wall was older than the rest, patched with slats from a time long before Elijah took over the ranch. Dusty pawed at the baseboard again. Elijah grabbed a crowbar from the tool bench and knelt. A few pries later, one plank fell loose, revealing what looked like faded red paint beneath. No branding. Hidden under the boards was a rough stencil, a whip crossed with the insignia of the old 3rd Mounted Infantry Regiment, Elijah's own unit. But this version was jagged, brutalized, twisted, and beneath it, scratched into the wood with what looked like a nail, "Fear teaches, but pain makes you obedient." Elijah recoiled as if burned. This wasn't just corruption. It was doctrine, something codified, practiced, passed along like rotten tradition. Someone had revived the methods from a darker corner of his own military past and brought them home to Granite Hollow. He backed away slowly, gaze fixed on Dusty. The Mustang stood still, eyes clear but expectant. "You showed me this," Elijah whispered. "You brought me here." He straightened up and grabbed the fallen plank, holding it like a fallen flag. Clara, had been right. Dusty wasn't just a victim. He was a witness. One who remembered, and someone had tried damn hard to make sure those memories stayed buried. But they'd failed. As Elijah nailed the boards back gently to preserve the evidence, his mind was already ahead, connecting threads. Victor wasn't just abusing horses for profit. He was using methods tied to military behavior conditioning. And that meant one thing. Someone taught him. The next move would be risky. Clara would help. Pete might talk if pushed. But Luca had seen more than he let on. And if he'd written that note, he might know where the other Mustangs had gone. Elijah turned off the lantern, the image of the branded wall still etched in his thoughts. They had tried to erase Dusty's memory, but they hadn't counted on loyalty being stronger than fear. Tomorrow, Elijah would start digging into Baylock, into Silvertrack Holdings, and into Victor's past. Because whatever they had done to Dusty, they were still doing to others. Snow had a way of silencing the world in Granite Hollow. It draped over rooftops, softened boot falls, and buried things that didn't want to be found. But that morning, beneath its deceptive calm, something was stirring raw, burning, and no longer content to stay hidden. Elijah stood by the corral fence, wind cutting across his face, staring at the blood-tinged snow where Dusty had just kicked loose a plank in his stall. The Mustang was restless again, nostrils flaring, ears pinned. Not out of fear, but urgency. He circled the paddock with quick, deliberate steps, pawing at the ground every few strides as if trying to show Elijah something invisible. The last 48 hours had peeled back the layers of what Elijah thought he knew. The emails, the falsified contracts, the traces of neurochemical agents Clara had pulled from Dusty's blood each piece hinted at a practice that was neither new nor isolated. But nothing yet was enough to bring Victor Kincaid down. Not officially. And without proof, the rot would only keep spreading, quiet and unchecked like fire crawling beneath dry pine needles. The first crack came when Elijah returned to Golden Spur at dawn. Pete Hargrove stood by the fence, shoulders slumped, eyes dim. Elijah didn't need to ask. Pete's silence screamed confession. "I didn't want this," Pete muttered, barely above the wind. "But Victor, he owns this whole valley now. I was just trying to hold on." Elijah didn't speak. He simply handed Pete a folded photograph one of Dusty, taken years ago, proud and unharmed, standing beneath the flag of Elijah's former cavalry unit. It wasn't a threat, it was a reminder. Pete's mouth quivered, and then, finally, the dam broke. Pete told him everything. About the deals done behind closed doors, the lease Victor had secured under the guise of rehabilitative training. The out-of-town buyers interested in wild Mustangs, not for ranch work, but for blood racing circuits in Nevada and Arizona. And about the secrecy, no cameras, no records, and no questions, just obedience and silence. But what shattered Elijah's restraint was what came next. "Luca's gone," Pete whispered. "Didn't show up for feed rounds this morning. Found this under his workbench." It was a hand-drawn map, small, rough, smeared with hay dust, but its meaning was unmistakable. A network of lines beneath the main barn, an X marked near the back slope, and scrawled beneath it, just 4 words, "They're still down there." Elijah drove back with the map clutched tight and his jaw locked. Clara met him halfway up the ridge, having gotten the same call from Pete. They didn't need to speak much. The plan formed between them in fragments. Clara retrieved her old drone, a weatherproof model she'd once used during vet research in remote pastures, and disguised it inside a soft canvas hat. Elijah prepped Dusty with extra feed and saddle tools, as if heading out for a routine ride. What they found beneath the ridge was anything but routine. It was just past sunset when they reached the site Luca's map pointed to. A low outbuilding nestled against a tree line, snow piled high against its shuttered sides. It looked long abandoned until Clara tapped her foot against the base and heard the echo. "Hollow," she said. "There's something underneath." They pried open a frozen hatch camouflaged with old lumber and crawled into a sloped corridor lit only by Clara's headlamp and the faint hum of machines below. The smell hit them first, sour, metallic, and sharp with disinfectant. Then the sound-soft whinnies, muffled snorts, and a clanging hoof against metal. Elijah's heart pounded. They emerged into what had once been a root cellar. Now it was a makeshift holding pen. 3 mustangs stood inside a series of wire-fenced stalls, ribs visible, hides marred with whip lines and bruises. One trembled on a shattered leg. Another bled from its flank, staining the straw beneath it. Beside the pens sat an array of syringes, rubber tubes, and a cooler still humming with power. Inside unmarked vials. Clara slipped the drone hat onto a hook above the center stall, clicked it once, then again. The lens whirred to life, capturing everything. That was when Dusty charged in. They hadn't even heard him approach. 1 minute the corridor was still. The next, Dusty tore through the far slats like a battering ram. His hooves shattered the side gate, splintered wood flying. He reared between the pens, driving back shadows and silence alike. The captive horses stirred, eyes wide, legs bracing. Something about Dusty's presence, his defiance, his fire woke something in them. The stallion leaned into the pen walls, using his weight to break the latches, and then the hatch above them banged open. Victor's voice was the first to echo down, sharp, amused, and unmistakably arrogant. Well, he called. Didn't expect the cavalry this late at night. He descended with 2 others broad men with shock gloves and cattle prods. Clara backed into Elijah's side. Dusty flared his nostrils and stood between them and the horses, muscles tensed. One of the men stepped forward, and Elijah recognized him instantly. "Brady?" he whispered. "Brady Yates?" The man smiled. "Long time, West." Brady had been in Elijah's unit nearly 20 years ago. Dishonorably discharged. Not for cowardice, but cruelty. Elijah had buried that name, that past. "What the hell are you doing here?" Brady shrugged. "Same thing I've always done. Training animals to obey. You just never had the stomach to finish the job." Victor stepped closer. "I offered you money, West. You could have walked away, but you chose to stick your nose where it didn't belong." "No," Elijah said quietly, reaching into his coat. "You brought this on yourself." The drone's red light blinked behind them. Live streaming, already transmitting. Victor's eyes followed the motion, his smug composure faltering. "You're finished," Elijah said, steady and sure. "This ends tonight." And behind him, Dusty reared again, his body silhouetted against the flare of Clara's headlamp. A guardian of the broken, the scarred, the silenced. Snow might have covered the town above them, but beneath it, something wild had survived. Something righteous, something no whip, no drug, no man could break. The fire had never gone out. It had just been waiting for the right moment to rise. Chapter 5. The Mustang Who Wouldn't Bow. Victor Kincaid's voice had barely left the rafters when the stallion struck. Dusty's hooves thundered against the barn floor, rattling the boards like a war drum. Wood split under his charge as the old stall door exploded outward in a cloud of frost and splinters. The other mustangs, battered but not broken, scattered behind him, their cries piercing the frozen air. They weren't fleeing, they were answering. Elijah West, crouched low behind the feed crates, pulled Clara Voss down just as the storm broke loose. Brady Yates had moved fast, too fast. The cattle prod in his hand sparked like a serpent's tongue, crackling with rage. He swung wide, aiming for Dusty's flank. But Elijah was faster. He surged forward, tackling his former comrade into a pile of dirty hay, fists finding flesh with a decade of righteous fury behind them. The two men tumbled through the straw, their bodies clashing with the weight of old scars and darker betrayals. Elijah didn't shout. He didn't snarl. He fought like a man reclaiming something that had been stolen. Clara crawled toward the shadows, her hand closing around the drone camera that had been rolling the entire time. When Victor lunged for her, it wasn't her scream that stopped him. It was the flash of gray and fire Dusty. The Mustang reared, hooves flailing inches from Victor's face. He slipped on the slick boards, scrambling backward, palms scraping against icy wood. He didn't fall from fear of Elijah. He fell because Dusty had looked him in the eye and not flinched. Outside, the barn door creaked. A boy stood in the frame. Luca, his silhouette small against the snow, but the flare gun in his hands didn't waver. "Don't you touch her," Ahab said. His voice didn't crack. Not this time. Victor hesitated. Brady didn't. He lunged up from the hay, reaching for Clara's arm. Elijah struck hard. The crack of bone meeting bone was sharp and final. Brady dropped like a felled tree, unmoving, groaning low. The barn quieted, save for the sound of Dusty's breath-deep, measured, untamed. The rest came in a blur. Luca handed Elijah a weather-worn notebook, his own record of everything he'd seen. Dates, names, times, even overheard phone calls about trucks leaving Granite Hollow in the dead of night. Clara checked the vials in the workbench drawer, their labels half scrubbed. She found the bottle nerve suppressant, unregulated and illegal for animal use. It matched the toxicology report from Dusty's blood work. They had it all. By dusk, the footage from the drone had been uploaded to every contact Elijah had in the military veterinary network. Clara's report followed, along with notarized witness statements. Pete Hargrove's affidavit arriving from Ruby's store, her fax machine humming into the cold evening. Victor Kincaid was arrested in his mountain cabin just before dawn. He'd been on the phone with a lawyer when they cuffed him. The list of charges was long enough to scroll. Animal cruelty, fraud, possession of banned substances, illegal animal transport across state lines. Brady was picked up at a diner near the county line, still wearing the same bloodied jacket. The news broke hard. Baylock scandal headlined papers from Denver to Cheyenne. Local ranchers sent in testimonies. Journalists camped outside Granite Hollow for weeks. The video of Dusty rearing before Victor went viral, drawing sympathy from every corner of the country. But to Elijah it was never about the headlines. It was about a Mustang who had waited too long for someone to listen. The trial was swift. Clara's expert testimony painted the whole picture. Luca's journal filled in the shadows. And the drone footage? It shattered any defense Victor's lawyers had built. He was sentenced to 22 years. Brady got 12. Pete Hargrove walked free, his name cleared after testifying in full. The aftermath didn't feel like victory. It felt like awakening. The Galloway Foundation contacted Clara within a week, offering Luca a full scholarship. Elijah watched the boy's hand shake when he read the letter, then still as he folded it into his pocket with a quiet nod. Galloway also funded the construction of a new barn at Elijah's ranch half-clinic, half-sanctuary. They named it the Hollow Refuge. Clara, once uncertain of her place in all this, was invited to publish her work on equine memory trauma at the Military Veterinary Academy, where Elijah had once trained green recruits. She accepted, not for prestige, but because Dusty's recovery had proven something the world had ignored for too long. Horses remember pain, but they also remember kindness. Dusty returned to his old pasture in the weeks that followed. He didn't bow anymore, not even for Elijah. And Elijah wouldn't have wanted him to. The Mustang moved like something older than war, older than cruelty. In the morning, he grazed beside two new arrivals' rescued Mustangs whose ribs still showed, but whose eyes, slowly, had started to shine. One evening, as snow returned to Granite Hollow, Elijah climbed the steps of his porch, Clara and Luca behind him. He took down the old, sun-faded photograph over the fireplace and replaced it with something new. In the frame, Clara's arm wrapped around Luca's shoulder, Elijah standing tall beside them. Behind them, Dusty and the other Mustangs stood in the wind, framed by the open doors of the refuge barn. Beneath the image, on a small brass plaque, were the words, "Some horses run from fear, but the rare ones like Dusty teach you to run through it." The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind rolled over the hills, brushing against the fences like a whisper. And somewhere in the dark, beneath the stars and the snow, the Mustang who wouldn't bow raised his head and listened, not for danger, but for peace, because finally it had arrived. Hoy ChatGPT.